Released in 1960, this horror thriller, directed by Alfred Hitchcock and starring Anthony Perkins, Janet Leigh, Vera Mills, and John Gavin, just to name a few, changed the way we watch movies in theaters forever. It had a lower budget than his previous hit North by Northwest, was filmed all in black and white, and has now been deemed by the Library of Congress as culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. It was nominated for 4 Oscars, including Best Supporting Actress for Leigh and Best Director for Hitchcock. Since Hitchcock's death in 1980, Universal Productions have spawned 3 sequels to this film, a remake that starred Vince Vaughn, and a prequel TV show, Bates Motel. Today, on You've Never Seen It, we're talking Psycho. Welcome to You've Never Seen It, an audio podcast where I am on a mission to never hear these 4 words again. I'm your host, Allison Salamone, and joining me today is one half of Ember Productions and Tony Award winner, Maxwell Haddad. Hi, Maxwell.
Hi, Allison. How are you today?
I'm doing so good. I'm so glad I got your last name right with the pronunciation on the first try and didn't have to go and redo this whole intro 14 times like I've had with other people.
There's honestly even a point of contention amongst myself and my sisters as to how we prefer to pronounce it, so whatever comes out is fine.
There's worse things that people have called me than Salamone, so I'll take it sometimes.
Yeah, fair enough. I always want to add an E. I always want to be like Salamone.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Salamone.
It is. That's exactly what it is. That's why I tell everyone it's Salamone, like alimony. And then people tend to get it. I always wanted, just even before we even get into the movie talk, I don't know if I've ever told you the story. Growing up, my last name was Mitchell. That's my maiden name. And I always, shocker, love attention. And so I always wanted to be one of those people who the teacher couldn't pronounce their last name and you had to remind them or just that little thing. And then I married someone where no one can pronounce the last name right. And I'm like, this is fucking stupid. This is the dumbest attention-seeking thing I've never wanted.
All I can say is be careful what you wish for.
Right? That's literally the epitome of...
I just wish that my name were harder to pronounce, and then you have a name with all consonants and no vowels, and you don't know what to do. Or yours, which is almost all vowels and no consonants.
Right, with just an E at the end, and everyone's is it silent? Is it a
hearty? Is it silent? Is it...
What is that? Well, welcome. I'm so excited to have you. This week, we're talking Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 Psycho. And this was one of the first ones you said you wanted to do. You were so excited about it. So even before getting into that, I want to get a little background on you and your love for movies and where that came from and what film means to you.
Oh, goodness. Okay, well, I went to film school. For starters, I spent 4 years studying the ins and outs of both, cinema history, cinema studies, as well as video production. And I actually took an elective exclusively on Hitchcock. So we dove deep into all of his films. I think it's a cliche, but Hitchcock is one of the greatest filmmakers of all time.
Oh, for sure.
Whether or not he was abusive on set is probably the case and worthy of discussion, as so many filmmakers of his ilk, Kubrick, etc., have these reputations for running such a tight ship that it crosses the line from just being a boss. But in terms of his output, if you look at his pre-Hollywood stuff in England all the way through to the ends of his career, he had far more hits than misses. And he was really one of the first filmmakers I latched onto in a way that said to me, oh, there's more to movies than just something you do on a Friday night with your friends when you're bored. Movies aren't just schlock, silly entertainment that so a lot of people always will treat them as, and particularly as a kid, you're prone to think. There were a couple movies that had a big influence on me, but the reason why Hitchcock always stood out is because at Universal Studios Orlando, when it first opened, all the way through till 2003, they had an exhibit that was called Alfred Hitchcock, The Art of Making Movies. This was an opening day exhibit, and it really was one of the first times I remember sort of like the shroud that exists for some people in the filmmaking process was lifted for me.
Okay.
And I got to see behind the scenes of how they set up the cameras, how they do certain tricks, how, you know, in-camera effects, how they do blood, all this sort of stuff. And I was really young, way too young to be watching this exhibit, because there was a particular sequence where they recreated the shower scene from Psycho, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And it was startling, but I was probably like 6 or 7, maybe younger, I don't know exactly when, seeing this. And it didn't necessarily make an impact on me at the time, but I remember when I got a little bit older and really started to dive into film, I reflected back and made sure that I got my family to take me back to Universal to see this. And this is back when Universal was actually about the process of movie making. Don't get me wrong, I still love Universal Studios. I have an annual pass. I go all the time.
Absolutely.
I think they're an amazing park. But it legitimately, when it first opened, for at least its first decade to 15 years, was about the movie making process. And I think that's partly because now with YouTube and cable TV, the process of making movies isn't as much of a secret as it used to be. I mean, now you could click on your phone, on your tablet, on your computer and see how things are done.
And with how much things are like digital or CGI now, or that's why one of my favorite things at Universal still is the horror makeup show, which it's so cheesy and they're funny, but it's talking about practical effects, and it's just something you don't see a whole lot anymore. And when you do, to me it's super special. Like, as dumb as most Michael Bay movies are, Ambulance was pretty much all practical effects with his explosions. It was pure Michael Bay perfection with all the cheesiness, and I loved it.
I really think you can tell the difference, even if, you know, general audience member doesn't necessarily automatically know why it feels different. I think our brains still process digital information versus something that was actually done and captured on film or digital differently. You know, you look at what you said, Ambulance. I didn't like it, but I did like that it was practical.
Right.
Compared to, I don't know, certain other movies where it's all CGI and there's no practical, and you can tell. And sometimes you can't make certain things happen without computers.
Sure.
But if you look back at Hitchcock, for example, if you look back through his career, he was an innovator. I mean, so much of what now is just secondhand to filmmakers, even student filmmakers or just, you know, a hobbyist who picks up their iPhone and makes a short film. These techniques that now we know like the back of our hands, he was creating them on the fly.
Yeah, one of my favorite little things that I think everyone always learns when you learn about Psycho is the one thing that comes to mind immediately is that he used chocolate syrup instead of the fake blood because it didn't look real. And so he found something else. It was black and white anyway, so no one was going to be able to tell what the color was, but it looked more real, which is still like when I watched it and that scene happened and I saw it and I remember watching it with, like you said, the Universal exhibit that was there, but then kind of really watching it, actually appreciating it now for what it is and appreciating film outside of being a casual movie watcher now. It was just like, like that. It looks like blood would look in a shower.
I took in film school, I took a special effects makeup class, and blood, one of the hardest things with blood is getting sort of the texture and viscosity right. And if you're doing black and white like Psycho did for so many reasons, chocolate syrup, like you said, it looks great. It looks like blood. It has the right texture. It has the right feel. The way it spreads and moves is more blood-like. Not that I necessarily have seen tons and tons of real blood in my life, but I've seen enough and had enough, you know, injuries or dealt with other people's injuries to know that sometimes in movies, blood is the right color and the wrong texture, or the right texture and the wrong color. So if shoot it in black and white, use Hershey's syrup and you're good to go.
Exactly. That's what I learned. That's my takeaway from it. So I kind of think with going into that is we talked about film and then Hitchcock in general. That's kind of, what is it about Psycho and why this movie?
there are so many things I could talk about Psycho, notably its impact on cinema history and horror and slasher films, and we can get all into that. But on its most basic, purest form, this is just a great movie. It is thrilling, visceral, surprising. As good and accomplished as any movie that comes out these days. It was shot on a shoestring budget. He used mostly the crew and the soundstage from his TV show because none of the studios he worked with wanted to give him enough of a budget to make this movie because, you know, at the time, the content of this movie was just stuff that you weren't seeing in movies, particularly Hollywood movies. It was really groundbreaking. But the fact that it is held up so well and plays as good as any modern movie that are using all these tricks and computers and all this stuff, it's just, I don't want to be one of those people who's like, they don't make them like they used to.
But they don't in some
but
cases.
They don't. And you know, and that's partly because the technology has shifted, but I also think you see a lot of cases where because the technology has shifted and because attention spans have shifted, filmmakers use those things as a crutch.
Yeah.
And Hitchcock, even in a movie that really, you know, compared to some of his other stuff, it's more populist, it's a little sillier. Even he said, he has this great quote where he's like, you know, you have to remember that Psycho is a film made with quite a sense of amusement on my part. To me, it's a fun picture. The process through which we take the audience, it's rather like taking them through the haunted house at the fairground or the roller coaster. And then he goes on and on. And so this movie, what it makes me feel is akin to what Jaws makes me feel, or what Jurassic Park makes me feel, or, you know, maybe to a slightly lesser extent, some of the better MCU movies make me feel. The fact that this has such great impact as cinema, but it's also just a damn fun thrill ride is why I keep coming back to it and why it's one of my favorites.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, I knew going into it, I knew the spoiler of who was Norman Bates's mother. Like, I knew that part of it. I knew it was him and with the whole split personality. What I didn't know, and what actually made me go, huh, was when Lila turns the chair around and it's the body. That part, by the way, we're full. I feel like I say this every time. Full spoilers. It's fine. But when the body turns around, like, I was expecting, because I knew that Norman Bates was also Mrs. Bates. When they turned the chair around, I thought that's where we see that reveal. No, we just see a very good, very well done prop dead body that is still decomposing. Yeah.
Though that moment is shocking, and it plays well because they did it practically, and the way it's shot with the music, it surprises you.
Yeah.
This movie is a movie of surprises. Like, we could talk about how this was really the first movie where a filmmaker was like, no, you have to see this movie from the beginning.
Yes.
Because, you know, it's hard for us to think, but I've talked to my dad and other people his age, like, in the 50s and early 60s and prior to that, people would go to the movies. They wouldn't look and see what time a movie is playing. They would just show up, you know, give their quarter or however much it cost, and just walk into a movie at whatever part of the film it was in, and then maybe stay through to the next showing to catch the beginning.
Right.
But because this movie, because Psycho has such a twist at the 45-minute mark, Hitchcock didn't want anyone showing up late. And if you read through the history, at the time, a lot of the theaters were really skeptical about this because this was not something that theaters did. People showed up and they just sat down. But it worked so well because, this was playing in not very many theaters. Lines started to form of people who needed to know what happened. This is really one of the first cases of spoilers in movies where people didn't want to get spoiled, so they showed up. They bought their ticket, they sat down when the movie was started, and they walked out. Even the trailers for this movie didn't really feature footage from the movie, which was more common at the time, but it's Hitchcock himself saying, this movie has twists, this movie has surprises, you need to come see it from the beginning, don't tell anyone what happens.
Yeah.
He was, aside from how great he was and innovative he was as a filmmaker, as a marketer, Hitchcock was brilliant. He captured it. He was like, what J.J. Abrams has tried to do to varying levels of success. I think it really succeeded with something like Cloverfield, and then some of his other stuff he gets too far up the puzzle box or gets to tell a good story. But
he gets too caught up in his blue lens flares, I feel like, sometimes.
maybe. But you can draw so many parallels to all the sorts of stuff that goes on in Hollywood to this day, for better or worse, to this movie and the impact.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I told you, when I texted my dad that I was watching Psycho, the first thing he said to me was, it changed how we went to theaters. We would not have the theater experience we have today, or maybe we would, I don't know. But I say that it does trace back to that whole moment, because films are obviously have grown since then, and he's been such a proprietor for the whodunit and for thrillers as a whole. So because of that, and then because of how he marketed it and how he he made people watch it, I couldn't even imagine just going to a movie, sitting down and just watching it from wherever it starts to going back through.
I mean, it's so wild to think, like, before Psycho, Hitch had made Rear Window and North by Northwest. Incredible movies. Imagine showing up halfway through Rear Window and just being like, you know what, I'll find out how this all started when the reel starts again in half an hour. I can't imagine that. Like,
no, there's no way.
I have a panic attack now if I think I'm going to be late to a movie. Like, I need to be seated before the trailers start so I can, like, assess the situation, get comfortable in my seat.
If I'm not already, like, almost done with my popcorn before the trailers start, like, I showed up way too late.
Exactly. It's like, I'm going back for a refill on this large.
That's exactly what I do.
Before the movie starts.
They're like, oh, I'm like, don't judge. Karen, give me my fucking popcorn.
But it really, this movie, just from the basic of how we go to the movie theater, it changed the game.
Absolutely. Oh, 100%. And then the other thing, and it's so funny, you mentioned Rear Window. That was actually, and I think you know this, but that was my first Hitchcock movie that I ever watched. This is now my second.
Okay. Okay.
And I don't know if, like, I feel like part of me is at this point where, like, I feel like maybe I should have reversed it because I knew about Psycho more, but also I still feel like Rear Window was, like, the best Hitchcock I could have gotten to begin with, because it wasn't as in-your-face horror as
most of his, I mean, maybe The Birds here and there, a couple other ones, but for the most part, he really made thrillers and mysteries more than out-and-out horror movies. Psycho is his horror movie. So maybe not starting it with it was good, because with Rear Window you get more of a taste for his formalism. It's a little more classic. It still is suspenseful. Great performance by Jimmy Stewart. Great use of space and those confines and you know.
Yeah. I love his use of the single room, or, like, the single location for, like, a Rear Window. And then Rope. Rope was my second one. So it was Rear Window, Rope, and then now this one.
Rope, I think Rope is another movie where you're like, how the... Can we curse here?
Oh, yeah. Go ahead. Explicit.
Rope is one where you watch it and you're like, how the fuck did he do this when he did it? Like, filmmakers now struggle for one shots, and you could see the seams a little bit when you watch Rope, where the reel is changing. Because remember, at the time, they're shooting on 35 millimeter. Right. Each reel has between 13 and 16 minutes approximately that you could film before you have to switch. So they would have to move the camera, stop it, like, behind a chair or at a desk, change the reel, not move the camera, and then pick it back up to fake it. Rope is a great movie, but as a technical accomplishment, holy crap.
Oh my God, I know. It didn't even hit me until, like, 15 to 20 minutes later, where I was like, oh fuck. That was just one shot, because I was so enthralled in the story and the dialogue. And I mean, that's Jimmy Stewart on any screen.
That's how you know it works, right? When you stop paying attention to the story on your first viewing, of something, in my opinion, when you lose the story and the characters and you're focusing too much on the technical aspects, or in the case of Rope, the gimmick that it's all quote unquote one shot, it failed. But the fact that you were so engrossed by the characters in the story, and then upon reflection were like, holy shit, they made that look like one shot, that means it worked. And that means the one shotness, one shotitude of that movie.
Not throwing away his shot.
Right. It's not throwing away his shot. It enhances.
Right. Absolutely.
the story and the characters. It's not there to be like lipstick on a pig.
Right. No, it's amazing.
And same thing with Psycho, right? Like we talked a little bit about how the content in here at the time was so shocking. Like I don't know how familiar you are with the Hays Code. The Hays Code in cinema predates the MPAA. Okay. It was the sort of rules in the mid 40s through the 60s that movies had to follow in order to be played in the theater and to pass, whatever sort of arbitrary censorship, sex, violence, cursing, etc., etc. But in the 50s, especially towards the late 50s, what happened was people started to buy TVs and had TVs at home. So all of a sudden, if people wanted to watch filmed entertainment, they didn't have to go to the theater anymore. And that's why you started to see films break the Hays Codes and say, you know what, screw it, I'm going to do what I want. And then by the mid-60s, late 60s, the Hays Code was gone and the MPAA came with PG and then R and then PG-13 came later. Right. But this movie said, screw the Hays Code, I'm going to do what I want. So at the time when Psycho was playing in America, there had never been an image of a toilet flushing on screen before in movie theaters.
That's crazy.
Seeing Janet Leigh in her underwear was shocking at the time. Now to see someone in their underwear in a movie, you see that in PG
modest movies. Underwear. She's in a bra and a slip, like with a little bit of midriff.
Not even like she's wearing a nightgown.
Right. Or a negligee or lingerie. She's wearing a full coverage bra. The other thing that I noticed with it and talking about the Hays Code is during the shower scene where you're getting nudity but not getting nudity. Like you get her stomach, you get the outline of a breast, you get.
So there, I'll make a long story really short. the censors at the time who approved that this movie could play theaters or not, some of them said you have to make edits because we see her breast. And then the other half of the censors said, no, we don't see your breast. You're crazy. So Hitchcock said, I'll edit it. He took the film back. He didn't edit a frame. He replayed it for him. The people who said that they saw the breast the first time now said they didn't. And the people who didn't now said they did.
That's
so he said,
crazy.
Okay, I will reshoot this scene if you all come to set and help guide me as to what to do. So he had this all set up. None of them showed up. So the movie ended up playing with his original cut just because it's so good at tricking you into thinking you're seeing things that you're not actually seeing, with shadow, with light, and with very, very clever camera placement.
That I did not know about this. But I remember, but in watching it, I was just like, that had to be, knowing that the time that this movie came out, just having a shower scene had to be something that was just, you didn't do it. And we don't get Janet Leigh in her underwear once, we get it twice. My
dad was, I'm sorry, Dad, I'm revealing your age. My dad was 18 when this movie came out. He was an adult, 18 years old. Still a kid, but, and he told me he remembers going to see it after there was some buzz, because my dad is not a film guy, but he goes to the movies, and he remembers the hubbub and the uproar and the conversation and the buzz. And he even said, like, because I was talking to him earlier, he was like, even I, an 18-year-old man, full-blooded American, was sort of like taken aback by how lewd it was. But now, you could turn on CSI or Law and Order and see far, far, far worse stuff on nightly network television. But at the time, like, a kid could watch this movie today and be like, this is tame. Context is everything. Like, all of this shit, the violence in the shower scene, the twist ending, dealing with dissociative identity disorder, this is stuff that was not shown in movies.
No.
It just wasn't. Maybe in some Italian stuff, maybe in some more obscure horror films that played, to theaters and got passed around, but a major American motion picture released by a student, no, just didn't happen.
Absolutely not. And you talk about it too, like, tame now compared to like what it would have been back then. I just recently had an episode on Sleepless in Seattle, and we talked about, like, we're talking about kids and things that they're saying, like, Sleepless in Seattle was a PG movie, but there's a scene where little Jonah is talking to Tom Hanks's Sam and makes a comment of like, if you get a new wife, are you going to have sex with her? And he's like, I sure hope so. And Sam goes, does that mean she's going to scratch up your back? So, like, it's just, the way that things have happened and how they've just kind of evolved. And I think it's incredible.
I would almost make the argument that I'm not talking about violence and horror, but in terms of sexuality, cinema is now more prude than it was in the 90s. I would say we have almost regressed sexually and become more puritanical, and we've leaned in more on the violence and the action. Which, for me, if I ever have kids, I would much rather them see, you know, oh no, that guy got shot, than, you know, two people, or rather the other way around. I would much rather frank, honest adult conversations about sex than, you know, seeing someone get shot and their head exploding with blood.
Sure.
What do I know?
No, I agree 100%. Yeah, and even going back into it with everything, and I need to talk about the smoke show that is Janet Leigh and her her not long enough time on my screen.
Well, and that's the thing, and that's the magic trick of this movie, right? Like, for the first 40 to 45 minutes, Janet Leigh is the main character, right? And by the way, I'm sure you know this, but for any listeners who don't, Janet Leigh is Jamie Lee Curtis's mother.
Yep.
And I do, before we're done here, I do want to talk a little bit about Halloween.
Of course.
Because this movie, Halloween and Scream, are, to me, a trilogy. And I'll explain why a little
I love Janet Leigh would you consider her like the first big Scream queen?
She was definitely up there, right? So, like, if we look at slasher cinema, this and Peeping Tom both came out in 1960. If I'm not mistaken, Peeping Tom was a few months earlier. But in terms of this sort of horror cinema, yeah, Janet Leigh was maybe the first, like, legit American Scream queen, yeah.
And then she goes on to have Jamie Lee Curtis, who helps define a whole new genre of Scream queens and slashers.
But just imagine it's 1959 when I assume Hitchcock is in pre-production or trying to get this movie made. It's based on a book which is heavily influenced by the real life serial killer Ed Gein.
Okay.
Right. So Norman Bates in this movie, not exactly, but the real life person he most takes from is Ed Gein, horrific guy. Imagine saying, yeah, we're going to make this movie starring Janet Leigh, who's moderately well known. She's the main character, and she dies less than halfway through the movie. And then we switch perspectives to the creepy guy running the motel whose motives are questionable. How do you sell that? Now you could get away with it. Now you could go to Jason Blum and he'd be like, yeah, here's $3 million. Go make a movie.
Right. Kid. But how do you sell killing off the person who's supposed to be bringing people into your movie early on in the movie? No, that definitely makes sense. And
so that alone is why I love this movie. It pulls the rug out from the audience, but it does it in a way that's dramatically satisfying. It's not a twist. Nothing in this movie is a twist for twist's sake. It's all elegantly constructed, telling this narrative that continues to build as it reveals more and more information to the audience until the ending, which I have a couple issues with, and we can talk about it, but I think the reveal that he was pretending to be his mother with some sort of personality disorder is great. It bugs me that some of the cops are like, oh, he's a transvestite.
Yeah.
Okay. It's 1960. You have to understand the context of the time. But in watching it now, that one little bit does play. I'm like,
I did the same thing. I kind of went, ugh, you know, and I mean, and then the psychiatrist was like, no, a man who likes to dress as a woman for sexual pleasure is and it's like, well, now that we know that there's more nuance to this and that there's more, there's a lot like other things that play into things, and it, you know, gender is fluid. Although, and you know, it doesn't matter.
You can't necessarily hold a work of art accountable for what was the prevailing psychological understanding at the time.
Exactly. It's the same thing. You know? I mean, I feel like that to me is seeing anything nowadays that's taking place in this day and age where people are still throwing the R word around. I'm like, you need to get better writing. Like,
I can't stand that. I hate that. It drives me crazy.
You need to get better writing. Period. End of story. Because there's so many other words and insults and things that you can use that's not that word. So I completely get it. And I think, but again, like you said, like looking back at the time, that was the terminology that was being used. Just like if they decided to use the word mentally R word, like that's what it right. that was the terminology at the time.
It's not an excuse, but it's an understanding.
Exactly. And, you know, moving forward, that you would hope that, you know, if in this day and age, if someone made this movie now, I mean, they kind of did in 98, but I don't think it did as well.
No. So, yeah, this movie was remade in 1998, directed by Gus Van Sant, who I think is a fascinating filmmaker, starring Anne Heche and Vince Vaughn as Norman Bates.
That's just wild to me.
For all intents and purposes, it's a shot-for-shot remake. Mm-hmm. The intent of it was to basically go back and recreate every single shot. So for me, as an intellectual exercise, it's fascinating. I have watched it a couple of times. I think it's really interesting to study. It is not something to be enjoyed.
Good. So it's not one. So I don't need to go and compare and contrast because I haven't seen that one either.
If we're talking a little bit about Psycho as a franchise, mm-hmm. there are many sequels. Psycho 2, I think, is worth watching, which didn't come until like 83. But what I actually am a huge fan of and recommend is the TV show Bates Motel.
Yeah.
This aired a couple years ago, starring Freddie Highmore and Vera Farmiga, and it's basically a prequel mm-hmm. because Vera Farmiga plays Norman's mom, and it's quite good. Freddie Highmore and Vera are great, but without spoiling too much of the show, it does eventually catch up to Psycho. Mm-hmm. And the events of Psycho do play out in the final season.
Okay.
But it wouldn't be a Psycho-based property if there weren't...
If it didn't, at some point, right?
If there weren't twists.
Right.
So, once again, I think, and I argue they successfully pull the rug out from under the audience. And the actress they cast to play the Janet Leigh role is Rihanna.
Oh,
which is just... Okay. Snaps for that.
Love that.
So if you or anyone listening is looking for a really good underappreciated TV show and you like Psycho, really like Bates Motel. It's a little rough at the beginning, but the acting from the get is good, and it's one of those shows where it gets better and better and better, and it nails the ending.
Little Freddie Highmore from he's a little boy in Finding Neverland who sits there crying on the bench to Johnny Depp.
You know, and then he was Charlie in the remake of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
Yes. Oh, little Freddie Highmore.
Now he stars on The Good Doctor, but he spent 5 years playing Norman Bates.
I know. I need to add that to my binge list. 100%. I've only ever heard good things about it. I didn't want to watch it because I hadn't seen Psycho, and like I know you don't need that, but the type of person I am, I feel like I don't think I would have the appreciation for it as a show if I didn't watch the original movie that it's based off of.
I agree with that. I agree. I think seeing Psycho before watching Bates Motel is the way to go.
For sure. And then kind of getting really into Psycho and starting to dig into your love of it. What would you say are your top 3... It feels weird to say it, but like your 3 favorite or I guess standout moments in this film.
Okay, so to me, the moment that makes this movie, and everyone's going to say the shower scene, and we've talked about it. The shower mm-hmm. scene is a masterclass in shot composition, in tension, in pulling the rug out for the audience. Legitimately, if you go back and look, people were not using showers at motels mm-hmm. for years. And in fact, there is a story, I don't know how true it is, but it feels true, that when Spielberg was making Jaws, he said, I want the beaches of America to be as empty as motel showers were after Psycho came out. But to me, the highlight of this movie and why I think it's so successful is the scene where Norman is trying to sink the car into the lake.
Okay.
And it's not working.
Mm-hmm.
And here I am watching this movie, and I've watched it many times, and I'm like, even though now I know the twist, I know that Norman's the bad guy. I know that he has a psychological disorder that makes him think he's his mother and go around killing multiple people. I still kind of want him to get away with this scene.
Yeah.
Credit to Anthony Perkins' performance for being so charming and sympathetic and weird. But it's just this sort of magic trick where Norman's weird. Like, there's this shot, and I've actually used this shot as like header photos for Twitter and Facebook over the years, where he's looking through the peephole into her room.
Yeah.
And it's just a close-up on his eye, and it's so beautifully composed. So you know something is off with Norman. He's a creepy guy. But still, there's something about this scene by the lake where the car is not sinking, and you're like freaking out. I'm like, I need this car to sink. I don't want him to get caught. And that, to me, is partly why this movie is so great, because... And I'm not like admitting anything here at all. It's just, it's so interesting that Hitchcock and his team were able to make you feel some sympathy for the killer. And he becomes the main character of the second half of the movie. Obviously, the sister and the boyfriend and there's the detective, they all come looking for her. But after Janet Leigh dies, the perspective sticks with Norman. And that is bold.
And I think, too, a lot of what those feelings play into it is how he is the subtle things he does in his affect and his face and his movements after the shower scene when he comes back in. So you think it's his mother, and then Norman comes in, sees what his mother has done, and you see the shock and the surprise and the desperation on his face of like, I gotta figure this out. We gotta, do whatever. So I think, again, giving those props to Anthony Perkins and how he played that role and how everything was done, it almost puts you into like, because you don't think it's him, right? And then once it all plays out and you see how it all wraps up and it was him, it just makes your mind boggle and explode even more.
I put Anthony Perkins on a very small list of greatest performances ever by an actor in a movie.
Oh, for sure. It's that end where he's just sitting there staring and he does the smile, and it's the creep. That is probably one of the creepiest endings I've ever watched in my life.
It's fantastic.
Because you just hear the voice in his head as it's going.
Yeah.
Incredible.
And he's in the sequels.
Okay.
And although none of them are as good, he is always bringing his A game. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I want to say the third one. Oh my goodness. He directed one of the sequels.
Oh, really? That's fun.
Yeah, I don't remember which one, and I'm remiss. But yeah, he got this really became his marquee character for his career. I mean, he did other stuff, but really this is what he's known for. He got an Oscar nomination for Friendly Persuasion a couple years before Psycho, and he's great in that. But really, once Psycho came, his whole career and life changed, and he just became... Yeah, he directed Psycho 3. Okay. I wasn't sure if it was 2 or 3. He directed Psycho 3, which is fine. Worth watching mostly because of, his full... Like, again... Norman Bates and Anthony Perkins became synonymous.
Right.
It's one of those things where a character and an actor were so well matched that, he got typecast, and really he did other stuff, but you don't ever hear about it.
Yeah. I'm in a group chat, and I had asked them prior to recording if I need to also watch the remake and do a compare and contrast episode, and everyone is saying no. And a friend of all... PLD is in this group chat and decided to let everyone know that Psycho 2 and Psycho 3 are both way better than they should be, period. Perkins fucks. The end.
I agree. I often do, but I happen to agree with Paul on this.
We often disagree, but in this case, for those who know PLD, we'll agree.
To be fair, I love long-running horror franchises because invariably the longer they run, the more crazy they get and the more swings they take, which can lead to great movies like Jason Lives and can lead to terrible movies like
Jason in Space,
Psycho and New Beginning.
It's still
it's
I walked in on my husband watching, he had bought at the beginning of the pandemic, the entire series. Amazon had a sale for the entire series, Jason, of all the Jason movies. And I remember going to the gym and coming home, and he had just started Jason 10 where he's in space. And it's the scene where he's literally coming out of being cryogenically frozen or whatever, and he takes that woman's head and sticks it in the frozen the whatever it is, liquid nitrogen, and freezes her face and then smashes it and the pieces go everywhere. And I was like, I'm all done. You enjoy this movie.
I think that's one of the best kills in any Friday the 13th movie. Not a great movie, but that scene,
he said one of the best deaths ever.
Yeah, it's really good.
What other two moments with Psycho would you say stand out to you the most?
Well, the shower scene, which we've talked about a lot. You know, it's sort of the scene everyone goes back to with that movie. And then the ending. You know, the reveal at the end. You sort of mentioned it when the sister turns around the mother and it's a skeleton. And then you go to the police station and that shot. It's that shot. Just him staring into the camera, sort of blank, but there's also a cold, calculated look to it. And one of the things about this movie is Hitchcock mostly shot this with 50 millimeter lenses. Not a ton of close-ups, not a lot of zooms, not a lot of pans. He really wanted it to almost be voyeuristic, to give it a really fly-on-the-wall approach. And he also uses some first-person footage, so you feel like you are the character, which was, of course, recreated in the opening of Halloween and is something that is used a lot in slashers. But that shot of Anthony as Norman at the end, just staring at the camera, it sticks with you.
It does. I watched it and then tried to go to bed. Ask me how well that worked out for me. It didn't.
How well did that work out?
Zero workout. Was not.
I think that's a testament to this movie. You know, now in 2022, 60 some odd years later after release of this movie, you're watching it at home. I don't know if you watched it on TV or a laptop or what. It's still clawing into you and making it hard for you to sleep.
It's literally living rent-free in the back of my head right now, like as we're talking. Like I did the face as we're recording this and I creeped myself out and said, no, thank you.
Well, you know, and that's the thing. I've talked a lot about how this is one of the grandfathers of slasher cinema, but it's also psychological horror.
Right.
And that's I think part of its impact is beyond just the visceral thrills of one mysterious character going around stabbing people, which is what slasher cinema is. It has this other level that really makes it, I think, stand above and beyond and really stick with you. Like these characters, Norman Bates as a character, what that represents, his motivation, his illness, is haunting because unfortunately, there are many people afflicted with this.
Right.
It is this is a sensationalized version of it played for thrills and entertainment. And I'm not going to sit here and say, that it's clinically accurate. But at the same time, because it is something that could happen, as opposed to something like Friday the 13th, where a boy who got bullied at summer camp rises from the water and then, as some sort of immortal dude with a hockey mask from movie 3 on starts killing people in various locations, eventually space, as we mentioned,
or like a Texas Chainsaw Massacre where we're making faces out of people that we kill and
right. And that sort of stuff does happen, unfortunately, to a much smaller. That was also based on Ed Gein.
Right.
A lot of horror movies in the 60s and 70s took inspiration from serial killer Ed Gein.
Because he was
Psycho. Insane. Psycho could happen. And I think the Janet Leigh character, Marion Crane, like, who hasn't had the fantasy of like running away from everything with some extra cash to like sort of start a new life, and then it's the weather's bad, you're not safe driving, you decide to pull over on the side of the road on what seems to be just a normal motel. And let's talk about the motel for a second. Arguably one of the greatest pieces of production design in cinema history. It is still standing on the Universal lot in Hollywood.
That's amazing.
When you go on the tram tour, you drive by it, and it has been refurbished and kept up, but it has stayed there. And as a little nugget for those of you listening who are familiar with the Schmodown, which I'm sure some of you are, I do believe that for a time, one Mr. Mike Kalinowski played Norman Bates on the tour and would chase after the trams coming out of the motel facility.
Of course he would.
Which is really fun.
I love it too. He also was in he was part of Poseidon's Adventure as another Mike Kalinowski.
He did Indiana Jones at Hollywood Studios, or at the time it might have been MGM in Florida. But yeah, he has been Norman Bates. But The fact that when you are on that tram tour, that is the original set is incredible. And it is one of the icons of horror cinema. It's haunting and scary. Just the architecture and construction of the house. And then particularly, there's something about, I know this audio only, there's something about the geography of the placement of the house to the rooms where the guests stay. How the house is always in the background, the rooms are in the foreground, that spatial difference and the way depth of field can be used between the two. It seems so far, but you know it's so close. It's kind of disorienting.
And it feels like it's just looming over. Like it's ominous.
Yeah.
It's a very ominous
The house is haunting the motel almost. It's like leering over it, ready to pounce.
Yes.
And when you see the shots of the mother, who you think is the mother, like in shadow in the window, that shit is scary.
Walking back and forth, and that's and
I am not. Go ahead.
And now knowing that that's not his mother, that's him in the wig, just walking back and forth and pacing, is just, it's horrifying when you think about it.
And I'm not really the type of person that gets scared by movies, right? Yeah, sure. A jump scare will startle me when it's quiet and then there's a loud noise. I am human. But in terms of like being afraid, it doesn't really happen that much. Maybe that's why I love horror so much, because I can handle it and I'm always looking for something to action. But these thoughts and ruminations on the impact of the movie, particularly being able to know the twists and look back, as you said, on what's actually happening, is haunting. You're like, holy shit, that's scary.
100%. Oh, absolutely. And I had a thought and now I lost it with talking about all of this. Going into kind of the other, I feel like the second player in all of this that is just as iconic as the film itself is the score and the soundtrack to it. And it's one of those, I mean, a good slasher movie is only amplified, or just a good horror movie is only amplified. I mean, when you think about the classics and and masterpieces that come to mind, the score goes hand in hand with it in my book. When you talk about Jaws and that, John Williams score, you talk about Carpenter and Halloween and how that score has become synonymous with it. And I think Psycho, 100%, the score that goes along with that entire film and how loud it gets. 'Cause like that's your jump scare, right? Is that loud? Like there's other things going on, but that score gets so loud and is so haunting and so jarring. It's just as infamous and as masterful as the film itself.
100%. Bernard Herrmann, who composed the score, is one of the great composers, particularly of cinema. I think his score for Vertigo is maybe the greatest score ever composed for a film, but Psycho is not far behind it. The strings, the heart, and another fascinating, for me at least, behind the scenes story is when Hitchcock was first making this movie, his original intention was for the shower scene to be silent, no score, just to let the sound of the knife and the screams have the impact, which on paper is not a terrible idea. We've seen movies where by cutting the score, it has more impact. And in test screenings, the scene was not having the impact Hitchcock hoped. Supposedly, Herrmann wrote music for it on his own accord as he's scoring the movie. When they put those harsh strings over the scene, Hitchcock was like, whatever we're paying Herrmann, double it, because holy crap, that it makes the scene, it makes the movie.
It gives me so much anxiety. Like you're already watching it, you know what's happening. You're terrified for this woman getting murdered in the shower, and then you have that just those strings and how it's going. You're just like, oh my god.
Well, even aside from the strings, like in the beginning when she's driving and it's like dun, 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 it's getting its hooks into you and it's ratcheting up the tension. I always like to joke that I am a score whore. Like other than the film itself, my favorite element in a movie is a great score.
Me too.
And this is a great score. It's not necessarily one I listen to often for pleasure because it's scary.
Right.
And kind of dissonant and not joyful to listen to, but gosh, it's so freaking good. And it's iconic. You play those strings.
You know what you're hearing.
most people would in some part of their brain be able to identify.
Oh, absolutely. 100%. Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. I love a good score. Like, and again, it's not a score that I don't have to listen to it every day for it to be a good score, Like, we're not talking John Williams' Duel of the Fate, which sounds beautiful and I can listen to on my drive home, or James Horner and his Rocketeer score, which is one of my favorite opening scores of all time, or themes of all time, is the Rocketeer theme. I think it's beautiful. If I need a good cry, sometimes I just put it on and cry to it in my own little corner in my own little chair. So it's like, it's what I do. But a good score can really make or break a movie, especially when you have a movie, I feel like Psycho, where there is action, but there's only 2 scenes of people getting killed, right? Everything else is going on psychologically, and it's suspense, and it's literally being on that edge of your seat. I wouldn't have been on the edge of my seat watching Janet Leigh drive down a road, not really being able to see with the rain, without that score.
Sometimes people will say, like, oh, the score is like so not for this movie necessarily, but in general, the score is so manipulative, it's telling you what to feel. That's the point. Mm-hmm. When you strip a score away from the movie, you're oftentimes left with an incomplete product. Why I think cinema is the greatest art form is it encompasses every possible type of art form. You have music, you have performance, you have painterly imagery when you take a film down to its stills.
Right.
So I agree. The score.
Well, before I start wrapping up and getting my Letterboxd score, I need to hear why Psycho, Halloween, and Scream are the perfect trilogy.
Oh, I'm so glad, because this is what I wanted to talk about next. Okay. So I would argue, and I think many would agree or disagree, I don't know, that each film represents a major turning point in horror, and particularly slasher cinema. I mentioned Peeping Tom, and I don't want to ignore the impact of Peeping Tom. But in terms of lasting impact and cultural impression, Psycho is more popular and beloved than Peeping Tom. Peeping Tom is good, watch it. But this is really the first major successful American slasher movie. We talked about how it changed the game, the Hays Code, all this. Mm-hmm. If you go to Halloween in the 70s, there are so many things in common. Jamie Lee Curtis is the lead. Janet Leigh is her mother. We open with the scene shot partly in first person, which is a style that was used in Psycho. Mm-hmm. Okay. And it also, on top of just being a slasher, has elements of psychological thriller, because it tries to give you an insight into Michael Myers through the character of the doctor. What is the doctor's name? Dr. Loomis. Mm-hmm. What is the boyfriend's name in Psycho? Sam Loomis.
Oh, see, I didn't even think about that.
Now let's cut to Scream in 1996. Slasher movies have been around for many years. Kevin Williamson, who wrote Scream, and Wes Craven, who directed it, said, you know what? We are going to make a movie that functions as a slasher, but also lampoons the tropes of the genre, not to the point that it's a parody, but that it's witty and has its tongue in its cheek. Skeet Ulrich plays Neve Campbell's boyfriend in that movie. What is his name? Billy Loomis. So here you have 3 movies that I think represent the 3 major turning points in American slasher cinema. You go from the progenitor to the one that set the scene alongside a couple others like Texas Chainsaw and Friday the 13th for the heyday of slashers in the 70s. And then in the mid-90s, when this genre has been around for so long, these guys are like, let's turn it on its head, let's make it fresh and new. But all 3 use similar thematic elements and the name Loomis. That's all by design. It's not a mistake that these 3 movies have prominent characters with the last name Loomis. They are as a spiritual and a thematic through line between the 3, and in terms of cinema history, these 3 movies, I think at the time they came out, are perfect representations for horror, particularly slasher cinema in the 60s, 70s, and 90s.
That's amazing. Incredible. And with all of that, Maxwell, you are my 3rd guest to pick a movie that gets the full 5 stars.
Ooh,
I don't write whole reviews or anything. I just give them stars and I move on. But I don't know how you can watch this movie and not give it 5 stars. There's just no way. There's no way.
It's impeccable.
It is from start to finish. It doesn't miss a beat. It's amazing, and it's one of those too where like we talked about after the murder in the shower. If you blink, you miss little subtleties. Like you have to be watching, but Hitchcock does such a good job of making you want to watch and making you want to sit on the edge of your seat and pay close attention and not look at a thing else.
Yeah, it's people always, to me, the sure sign of a great movie, barring a few exceptions where the content is so depressing you can't watch it. If this movie is on TV, I'm gonna stop everything I'm doing and watch it.
Yeah,
you cannot look away. Nope. Doesn't matter how many times I've seen it. Doesn't matter. Like I could be having a life-changing argument with someone and Psycho's on the TV. I'm sitting down. I'm like, we're gonna finish this discussion after Psycho.
Perfect. Exactly. We will talk when this is over.
The psycho rule. Oh, I just want to mention one thing. Yeah. If anyone listening or you are really interested in this movie, there's a book that I love called The Moment of Psycho: How Alfred Hitchcock Taught America to Love Murder by David Thompson.
Okay. There's
a lot of books about Hitchcock. There's more than one book about the making of Psycho. This one to me is the best. It has the most interesting perspective, and if you want to be a real movie nerd and do more reading about this movie, that is my recommendation for the book. I've read it a couple times. Love it.
I'm on it. Well, Maxwell, thank you so much for coming and hanging out with me. Before we get out of here, where can people find you? What you got going on?
You could find me on the old Twitter at CineMaxwell. You could find me with my partner in crime, Amber Coates, over at Ember Productions. That's Ember Products, P-R-O-D-U-X on Twitter. We have a YouTube channel where we do movie reviews, TV recaps, and we're going to be having some theme park and Broadway content coming up. We're having a lot of fun over there. Check it out if you haven't yet. We're just really getting started. We have big plans, and we're not slowing down anytime soon.
I'm so excited. I'm so excited for you guys with your Ember. If you guys haven't been able to tell, Maxwell is the M in Ember. And if all of you listening are enjoying what you're hearing, please make sure you subscribe, rate, and review to Flick and Reel on whatever audio platform you're listening to us on. If you're listening on YouTube, please make sure to comment, subscribe, and like, and let me know your thoughts on Psycho and any of the other films that we've covered previously. And make sure you're hitting that little bell for the notifications so anytime we drop any new content. You can follow the show on Twitter at NeverSeenItFNR, and you can follow me at Allison Salamone. And until next time, my friends, let's all be safe and let's go watch some movies.